Imagine a world that honestly looks a lot like our own. You've got this massive, interconnected global economy.
Right.
Superpowers are signing peace treaties. They've got diplomatic hotlines. They're even marrying into each other's families to lock in alliances.
Very familiar picture.
Exactly. And you've got this incredibly complex, sort of just-in-time supply chain moving strategic resources across entire continents. And the people in this world, they believe with total certainty that this golden age will go on forever.
Sounds like you're describing the early 21st century.
I could be, but we're not. For this deep dive, we're conducting a strategic assessment of the late Bronze Age, specifically that period between, say, the 15th and 13th centuries BC.
And the reason this is so critical to analyze is because that system, that whole globalized ancient world, it didn't just fade away.
No, it crashed hard.
It's arguably the most catastrophic system failure in all of recorded history.
We are talking about the complete collapse of what was basically the G7 of antiquity. The Egyptians, the Hittites, the Mycenaeans, the Babylonians. Within just a few decades, the lights just went out. Writing stopped. Cities burned. And the central question, our mission for today, is to figure out why. How does a system that big, that wealthy, that powerful just fail so completely?
Well, to answer that, we have to strip away the sort of pop culture version of history. It's not about finding some barbarians at the gate.
It's more complicated.
Much more. We have to look at the architecture of the system itself. This wasn't really a military defeat. It was a systemic collapse.
Okay, so let's start with phase 0, the strategic overview. I think when most people hear Bronze Age, they picture, primitive tribes, guys in loincloths banging rocks together.
Yeah, that's the stereotype.
But the sources we have paint a picture that is just shocking in its modernity.
It's completely different. If you walked into a palace in Ugarit, that's in modern Syria, or Thebes in Egypt, or at Tusa in Turkey around, say, 1250 BC,
Yeah.
you weren't stepping into some isolated village.
No.
You were stepping into a node of what some call a hyper-coherent international network.
Hypercoherent. That's a term from complexity theory, isn't it?
It is, yeah. In this context, it just means the parts of the system are so tightly coupled that they can't really function on their own anymore.
So the great powers of the time, the Hittites, Mycenaeans, Egyptians, Assyrians, they weren't just neighbors.
Not at all. They were integrated. Politically, economically, diplomatically, they basically formed a single intersocietal ecosystem.
I was reading about the Amarna letters, which are essentially the diplomatic email archives of the Bronze Age.
They're fascinating.
And the way these kings talk to each other, it's surprisingly personal.
It really is. They call each other my brother. They're constantly engaging these high-level gift exchanges. They swap doctors, sculptors, architects.
Right.
There's a famous letter where the king of Anatolia is actually nagging the king of Babylon because a doctor he borrowed years ago hasn't been returned yet.
So he's filing a customer service complaint with another superpower.
That's basically it. And it implies this level of shared culture and professional exchange that we usually assume didn't happen until, the Roman Empire or even later.
And it wasn't just the elites, it was the physical goods. Which brings us to the strategic supply chain. Because you can't have a Bronze Age without massive logistical networks.
Absolutely not. And if you do a supply chain analysis, the depth is staggering. Take lapis lazuli, for example.
That deep blue stone.
The one the pharaohs were obsessed with, it was the ultimate status symbol. Think of it like diamonds or high-end tech today.
And it's all over King Tut's death mask.
Exactly. But here's the strategic catch. The only place you could get lapis lazuli in any quantity in the ancient world was the Badakhshan region.
Which is modern-day Afghanistan.
Right. So for that blue stone to end up on a pharaoh's face in Egypt, it had to travel thousands of kilometers along the Great Khorasan Road, through Iran, over the Zagros Mountains, through Sumerian middlemen in Mesopotamia, overland to the Levant, and then finally shipped down the Nile.
On a donkey caravan. You're talking multiple borders, tariffs, security. It's a logistical nightmare.
It is, but that was just a luxury. The real strategic weakness, the single point of failure, was the namesake of the era itself. Bronze.
Because bronze is an alloy. You need the ingredients.
You do. You need copper, which was fairly common. Cyprus was loaded with it. The name Cyprus is probably related to the word for copper.
But you also need tin.
And tin is incredibly rare in the Mediterranean and the Near East.
I read a quote from Carol Bell, a British academic. She said, looking at tin in the late Bronze Age is like looking at crude oil today.
That's the perfect analogy.
Yeah.
Without tin, you can't make bronze. No bronze means no weapons, no tools, no army. And just like the lapis, The tin was coming all the way from Afghanistan and even further east.
So the Mycenaean Greeks, famous for their armor and swords?
Had absolutely no tin of their own. They were 100% dependent on a supply chain that stretched through 3 or 4 other civilizations just to keep their military running.
That is an unbelievable risk. Your entire state can be effectively demilitarized if a trade route thousands of miles away gets cut.
It's the definition of strategic vulnerability. And it gets even deeper. Recent bioarchaeological intel has completely blown up our timeline on this.
This is the Sea-Lynx project stuff.
Yes, from Philip Stockhammer's team, they analyzed the dental calculus of people living in the Levant.
Dental calculus. So ancient plaque on their teeth.
A polite way of putting it, yes. It traps tiny food particles. And in the teeth of these Bronze Age people, they found proteins from turmeric and bananas.
Bananas in the Mediterranean 3,000 years ago.
South and East Asian foods. That implies trade networks reached all the way to India and Southeast Asia 1,000 years earlier than we ever thought.
So we need to completely adjust our mental map. This isn't just a Mediterranean system. It's a massive artery of trade connecting Africa, Asia, and Europe. A true globalized world system.
Which brings us right back to that central strategic question. You have this wealthy, sophisticated, tightly knit system. It has treaties, stability, global trade. And then around 1177 BC,
It dies.
it just dies.
All right, this moves us into our situation report, the Satrap. We fast forward to year 8 of the reign of Pharaoh Ramses III, and according to the Egyptian records, the world is suddenly on fire.
The records describe this massive wave of invaders. Ramses III calls them the Sea Peoples.
Now, Sea Peoples, that sounds a bit vague. Is that a specific nation? A unified army?
No, and that's the confusing part. It's really a modern umbrella term. The Egyptians listed out specific groups, the Peliset, the Checker, the Sheklesh, the Shardana.
And they describe them as foreign-looking. I've seen the reliefs at Medinet Habu. They have horn helmets, feathered headdresses, round shields.
Right, it looks like a raid, like Vikings showing up to pillage the coast.
And that's what historians thought for a long time, a military strike force.
But the intelligence assessment on that has shifted.
Sure.
Big time. Because if you look really closely at those same carvings, it wasn't just warriors.
What else was there?
They had ox carts.
Ox carts.
Yes. And inside the ox carts were women and children.
Okay. That changes the entire profile. You do not bring your family and your furniture on a military raid.
You don't. This wasn't an invasion. It was a migration, a mass displacement of people. They weren't just coming to loot. They were coming to stay. They were looking for a new home.
And they left a trail of destruction, that is. It's hard to comprehend. We have archaeological evidence, thick ash layers, arrowheads in the walls, at Hattusa in Anatolia, Ugarit in Syria, all over the Levant and Cyprus.
Ramses III claimed that no land could stand before them. He lists the victims, the Hittites, Quode, Karshmish. These are the great powers we were just talking about.
They fell like dominoes.
Egypt just barely managed to repel the invasion. The pharaoh won the battle, but the kingdom was so weakened it never really recovered its former glory.
So, for a long time, the history books just blame the Sea Peoples. They were the bad guys who broke civilization.
But that's way too simple. It's treating the symptom as the disease.
Right, it's monocausal thinking.
The new intelligence suggests the Sea Peoples were likely the final blow, or maybe just another complication, in a much larger perfect storm, a multi-vector threat that hit the system from every possible angle at once.
Let's break down those vectors in our tactical analysis, because it seems like the Earth itself was turning against them.
Literally, Vector 1 is seismic activity, what we call an earthquake storm.
That sounds like a terrible disaster movie, but the geological data actually backs it up.
It does. We see this phenomenon called a seismic fault unzipping. Between about 1225 and 1175 BC, a series of major earthquakes just rips across the region. We found physical evidence, cracked walls, bodies under rubble at Mycenae, Troy, Hattusa, Ugarit.
So imagine trying to run a complex empire when your defensive walls, your granaries, your ports are physically crumbling every few years.
It just degrades your entire infrastructure, your ability to project power. But you get hit with Vector 2, climatological warfare.
Nature turned off the water.
Exactly.
Yeah.
A mega drought, a 300-year event. Pollen cores taken from the Sea of Galilee and the Dead Sea show this period of severe dryness starting around 1250 BC.
And you can actually see the panic in the diplomatic letters. There's that message from the Hittite king to Egypt. He doesn't mince words. He just says, I have no grain in my lands.
That is a desperate admission for a superpower. It's like the U.S. president asking for food aid. We even see the Egyptian pharaoh Merneptah boasting that he sent grain ships to keep the land of Hatti alive. The bread baskets were failing.
So let's put ourselves in their shoes. You've got earthquakes shattering your defenses. You have a drought killing your crops. Famine sets in.
And what do people do when they're starving?
They move.
They move.
Yeah.
This is the multiplier effect. The drought leads to famine. The famine leads to migration. Those sea peoples with their ox carts.
They weren't conquered.
Probably not. They were climate refugees. They were likely fleeing their own disasters in the West, maybe from Italy or Greece, and pushing east, just looking for food.
But when a massive group of armed refugees shows up in a land that is already starving.
Conflict is inevitable. They displace the locals, who then have to move and attack their neighbors. It becomes a cascading failure. The sea peoples were both victims and oppressors in this cycle.
It's a domino effect. But I want to zoom out to phase 3, strategic implications. Because civilizations face droughts and wars all the time. Why did this specific international system collapse so completely? Why a dark age instead of just a recession?
And this brings us right back to that idea of hypercoherence. We said their interconnectedness was their strength. It made them rich.
But it was also their fatal flaw.
Exactly. Complexity theory tells us that. Think of it like the 2008 financial crisis. We had a too-big-to-fail scenario where toxic assets in one market nearly took down the entire global economy.
So, in the late Bronze Age, the states were so interdependent they lost their individual resilience. If Hittite agriculture fails, it crashes the Egyptian economy because trade stops.
Precisely. Or look at the supply chain again. Political instability hits Mesopotamia, the middleman. The tin stops flowing. If the tin stops, the Mycenaean army in Greece can't repair their weapons. If they can't repair weapons, they can't defend against the migrants. A shock in one sector just cascades through the whole system.
The sources also talk a lot about their palace economies. Can you unpack that? Because their economic model seems to have been uniquely vulnerable.
It was. The palace economy was a centralized, top-down system.
Yeah.
The palace was, Amazon, the Federal Reserve, and the government all rolled into one.
So the king collected all the resources, grain, oil, wool, brought them into palace warehouses, and then redistributed them.
Yes.
There were very few private markets. The whole system relied on the center holding. So if the palace gets burned down by migrants or the king just can't get grain from Egypt, the distribution network vanishes. Instantly. Nobody eats. That's an incredibly brittle system. Efficient, maybe, when it works.
But catastrophic when it fails.
Yeah.
And when it shattered, people had to adapt fast. We see a shift from these massive centralized palaces to decentralized private survival. And there's a fascinating sort of biopolitical adaptation mentioned in the sources that really shows this desperation.
This is the cousin marriage thing.
Yeah. Philip Stockhammer's research found that during this collapse in the Aegean, people started practicing strict endogamy, specifically marrying their first cousins.
That seems so counterintuitive. You'd think you'd want to marry outside the family to build alliances.
In good times, yes.
Yeah.
But in a collapse, when there's no central authority and resources are scarce, you cannot afford to split the family farm with an outsider. It was a strategic mechanism to keep the land, the calories, within the immediate clan, a desperate attempt to survive the chaos.
That really brings it down to the human level. It wasn't just maps and empires. It was families making these hard, strange choices just to hold on to their land. So let's move to phase 4. Scenarios. The dust settles. What happens next? We always hear about the Dark Age.
And that's outcome 1. And it was very real. We saw a massive drop in sociopolitical complexity. Literacy vanished in Greece. The linear B script was just lost. They literally forgot how to write.
Wow.
Monumental architecture stopped. People abandoned the coasts and moved into the hills for safety. It was a grim, grim time.
But the sources also point to outcome 2, decentralization and innovation.
Yes, the collapse of that heavy top-down palace administration created a vacuum. And that vacuum allowed for the rise of the little guys, the private entrepreneurs. We see the rise of smaller, more agile city-states like the Phoenicians and the Israelites. And crucially, we see the tech shift that names the next era.
The move from bronze to iron.
Exactly. And this is the key detail. The Iron Age didn't happen because iron was better. Early iron was actually softer and worse than high-quality bronze.
Wait, really? I always just assumed iron was the big upgrade, like going from a DVD to streaming.
Not at first, no. They switched to iron because they had to. The supply chains were broken. They couldn't get tin from Afghanistan anymore. But iron ore,
You can find that almost anywhere.
you can dig it up in your own backyard. So the Iron Age was basically a supply chain hack. It was a local solution to a global failure. And once they mastered it, it democratized warfare and tools because you didn't need a king with a global trade network to afford a sword anymore.
That is a fantastic reframing.
Hmm.
So if we look at this systems collapse model as our final conclusion, what's the verdict?
The verdict is that it wasn't linear. It wasn't just drought caused famine caused war. It was messy. It was non-linear. You had multiple stressors, earthquakes, climate, migration, trade shocks, all feeding back into the system at the same time. The system just reached a tipping point where it could no longer absorb the shocks.
It's terrifying how fragile complexity can be.
It is. The very things that made the late Bronze Age a golden age, the globalization, the interdependence, the specialization, were the things that ensured that when it fell, everyone fell together.
Okay, so let's wrap this deep dive with a final thought. We've looked at the strategic assets, the threats, the systemic failures, and we're left with a picture of a world that looked stable, wealthy, and invincible, right up until the moment it wasn't.
That's the ultimate strategic assessment. Complexity does not equal immunity. In fact, complexity often breeds fragility. The late Bronze Age civilizations were arguably the most sophisticated societies the world had seen up to that point. But a perfect storm exposed their single point of failure, their total reliance on each other.
Which leaves us with a provocative thought for you, the listener, to mull over. If a globalized, sophisticated system collapsed due to a convergence of climate change, mass migration, and supply chain shocks 3,000 years ago, what does that imply for the resilience of our current system? We're more connected than the Hittites and Egyptians ever were. Our supply chains are tighter. Our climate is changing. Are we actually more resilient than they were, or are we just more efficient at transmitting the crash?
That is the question we should all be asking.
That's it for this deep dive. Thanks for listening.